Chapter 16. 12 o'clock. London appeared. Suddenly the clouds rolled back and the late morning sun brought the whole city, shining, into view. There was Battersea Power Station, standing proud with its 4 great chimneys still intact, even though much of its roof had long ago been eaten away. Behind it, Battersea Park appeared as a square of dense green bushes and trees that were making a last stand, fighting back the urban spread. In the far distance, the Millennium Wheel perched like a fabulous silver coin, balancing effortlessly on its rim. And all around it London crouched, gas towers and apartment blocks, endless rows of shops and houses, roads, railways, and bridges stretching away on both sides, separated only by the bright silver crack in the landscape that was the River Thames. Alex saw all this with a clenched stomach, looking out through the open door of the aircraft. He'd had 50 minutes to think about what he had to do. 50 minutes while the plane droned over Cornwall and Devon, then Somerset and the Salisbury Plains, before reaching the North Downs and on toward Windsor and London. When he had got into the plane, he had intended to use the radio to call the police or anyone else who might be listening. But seeing Mr. Grin at the controls had changed all that. He remembered how fast the man had been when he encountered him outside the bedroom. He knew he was safe enough in the cargo area, with Mr. Grin strapped into the pilot's seat at the front of the plane. But he didn't dare get any closer. Even with the gun, it would be too dangerous. He had thought of forcing Mr. Grin to land the plane at Heathrow. The radio had started squawking the moment they'd entered London airspace and had only stopped when Mr. Grin turned it off. But that would never have worked. By the time they reached the airport, touched down, and coasted to a halt, it would be far too late. And then, sitting hunched up in the cargo area, Alex had recognized the 2 bundles lying on the floor next to him. They had told him exactly what he had to do. "Irk," Mr. Grin said. He twisted around in his seat, and for the last time, Alex saw the hideous smile that the circus knife had torn through his cheeks. "Thanks for the ride," Alex said, and jumped out of the open door. The bundles were parachutes. Alex had checked them out and strapped one onto his back when they were still overreading. He was glad that he'd spent a day on parachute training with the SAS, although this flight had been even worse than the one he'd endured over the Welsh valleys. This time there was no static line. There had been no one to reassure him that his parachute was properly packed. If he could have thought of any other way to reach the Science Museum in the 7 minutes that he had left, he would have taken it. There was no other way. He knew that. So he had jumped. Once he was over the threshold, it wasn't so bad. There was a moment of dizzying confusion as the wind hit him once again. He closed his eyes and forced himself to count to 3. Pull too early and the parachute might snag on the plane's tail. Even so, his hand was clenched and he had barely reached 3 before he was pulling with all his strength. The parachute blossomed open above him and he was jerked back upward, the harness cutting into his armpits and sides. They had been flying at 10,000 feet. When Alex opened his eyes, he was surprised by his sense of calm. He was dangling in the air, underneath a comforting canopy of white silk. He felt as if he wasn't moving at all. Now that he had left the plane, the city seemed even more distant and unreal. It was just him, the sky, and London. He was almost enjoying himself. And then, he heard the plane coming back. It was already a mile or more away, but now he saw it bank steeply to the right, making a sharp turn. The engines rose, the plane leveled out, and it headed straight toward him. Mr. Grin wasn't going to let him get away so easily. As the plane drew closer and closer, he could imagine the man's never-ending smile behind the window of the cockpit. Mr. Grin intended to steer the plane straight into him, to cut him to shreds in midair. But Alex had been expecting it. He reached down and took the Game Boy out of his trouser pocket. This time there was no game cartridge in it, But he had slipped Bomber Boy out a long time ago and slid it across the floor of the empty cargo plane. That was where it was now. Just behind Mr. Grin's seat. A smoke bomb. Set off by remote control. He pressed the start button 3 times. Inside the plane the cartridge exploded, releasing a cloud of acrid yellow smoke. The smoke billowed out through the hold, curling against the windows, trailing out of the open door. Mr. Grin vanished, completely surrounded by smoke. The plane wobbled, then plunged down. Alex watched the plane dive. He could imagine Mr. Grin blinded, fighting for control. The plane began to twist, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The engines whined. Now it was heading straight for the ground, howling through the sky. Yellow smoke trailed out in its wake. At the last minute, Mr. Grin managed to bring up the nose again. But it was much too late. The plane smashed into what looked like a deserted piece of dock land near the River Thames and disappeared in a ball of flame. Alex looked at his watch. 3 minutes to 12. He was still thousands of feet in the air, and unless he landed on the very doorstep of the Science Museum, he wasn't going to make it. Grabbing hold of the ropes, using them to steer himself, he tried to work out the fastest way down. Inside the East Hall of the Science Museum, Herod Sale was coming to the end of his speech. The entire chamber had been transformed for the great moment when the Stormbreakers would be brought online. The room was caught between old and new, between stone colonnades and stainless steel floors, between the very latest in high-tech and old curiosities from the Industrial Revolution. A podium had been set up in the center for Sale, the Prime Minister, his press secretary, and the Minister of State for Education. In front of them were 12 rows of chairs, for journalists, teachers, invited friends. Alan Blunt was in the front row, as emotionless as ever. Mrs. Jones, dressed in black with a large brooch on her lapel, was next to him. On either side television towers had been constructed with cameras focusing in as Sale spoke. The speech was being broadcast live to schools throughout the country, and it would also be shown on the evening news. The hall was packed with another 200 or 300 people, standing on first and second floor galleries, looking down on the podium from all sides. As Sale spoke, tape recorders turned and light bulbs flashed. Never before had a private individual made so generous a gift to the nation. This was an event. History in the making. It is the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister alone, who is responsible for what is about to happen, Sale was saying. And I hope that tonight, when he reflects on what has happened today throughout this country, that he will remember our days together at school and everything he did at that time. I think tonight the country will know him for the man he is. One thing is sure. This is a day you will never forget. He bowed. There was a scattering of applause. The Prime Minister glanced at his press secretary, puzzled. The press secretary shrugged with barely concealed rudeness. The Prime Minister took his place in front of the microphone. I'm not quite sure how to respond to that, he joked, and all the journalists laughed. The government had such a large majority that they knew it was in their best interests to laugh at the Prime Minister's jokes. I'm glad that Mr. Sale has such happy memories of our school days together, and I'm glad that the two of us, together, today, can make such a vital difference to our nation's schools. Herod Sale gestured at a table slightly to one side of the podium. On the table was a Stormbreaker computer and, next to it, a mouse. This is the master control, he said. Click on the mouse and all the computers will come online. Right? The Prime Minister lifted his finger and adjusted his position so that the cameras could get his best profile. Somewhere outside the museum, a clock struck 12. Alex heard the clock from about 500 feet up, with the roof of the Science Museum rushing toward him. He had seen the building just after the plane had crashed. It hadn't been easy finding it, with the city spread out like a three-dimensional map right underneath him. On the other hand, He had lived his whole life in West London and had visited the museum often enough. First, he had seen the Victorian pile that was Albert Hall. Directly south of it was a tall white tower surmounted by a green dome, Imperial College. As Alex dropped, he seemed to be moving faster. The whole city had become a fantastic jigsaw puzzle, and he knew he only had seconds to piece it together. A wide, extravagant building with church-like towers and windows. That had to be the Natural History Museum. The Natural History Museum was on Cromwell Road. How did you get from there to the Science Museum? Of course, turn left at the Lights Up Exhibition Road. And there it was. Alex pulled at the parachute, guiding himself toward it. How small it looked compared to the other landmarks, a rectangular building jutting in from the main road with a flat gray roof and, next to it, a series of arches, the sort of thing you might see on a railway station or perhaps an enormous conservatory. They were a dull orange in color, curving one after the other. It looked as if they were made of glass. Alex could land on the flat roof. Then all he would have to do was look through the curved one. He still had the gun he had taken from the guard. He could use it to warn the Prime Minister. If he had to, he figured, he could use it to shoot Herod Sale. Somehow he managed to maneuver himself over the museum. But it was only as he fell the last 500 feet, as he heard the clock strike 12, that he realized two things. He was falling much too fast. And he had missed the flat roof. In fact, the Science Museum has two roofs. The original is Georgian and made of wired glass. But sometime recently, it must have leaked because the curators constructed a second roof of plastic sheeting over the top. This was the orange roof that Alex had seen. He crashed into it with both feet at about 30 miles per hour. The roof shattered. He continued straight through, into an inner chamber, just missing a network of steel girders and maintenance ladders. He barely had time to register what looked like a brown carpet, stretched out over the curving surface below. Then he hit it and tore through that too. It was no more than a thin cover, designed to keep the light and dust off the glass that it covered. With a yell, Alex smashed through the glass. At last his parachute caught on a beam. He jerked to a halt, swinging in midair inside the East Hall. This was what he saw. Far below him, all around him, 300 people had stopped and were staring up at him in shock. There were more people sitting on chairs directly underneath him, and some of them had been hit. There was blood and broken glass. A bridge made of green glass slats stretched across the hall. There was a futuristic information desk, and in front of it, at the very center of everything, was a makeshift stage. He saw the Stormbreaker first. Then, with a sense of disbelief, he recognized the Prime Minister standing, slack-jawed, next to Herod Sale. Alex hung in the air, dangling at the end of the parachute. As the last pieces of glass fell and disintegrated on the terracotta floor, movement and sound returned to the East Hall in an ever-widening wave. The security men were the first to react. Anonymous and invisible when they needed to be, they were suddenly everywhere, appearing from behind colonnades, from underneath the television towers, running across the green bridge, guns in hands that had been empty a second before. Alex had also drawn his own gun, pulling it out from the waistband of his trousers. Maybe he could explain why he was here before Sale or the Prime Minister activated the Stormbreakers. But he doubted it. Shoot first and ask questions later was a line from a bad film. But even bad films are sometimes right. He emptied the gun. The bullets echoed around the room, surprisingly loud. Now people were screaming, the journalists punching and pushing as they fought for cover. The first bullet smashed into the information desk. The second hit the Prime Minister in the hand, his finger less than an inch away from the mouse. The third hit the mouse, blowing it into fragments. The fourth hit an electrical connection, disintegrating the plug and short-circuiting it. Sale had dived forward, determined to click on the mouse himself. The fifth and the sixth bullets hit him. As soon as Alex had fired the last bullet, he dropped the gun, letting it clatter to the floor below, and held up the palms of his hands. He felt ridiculous, hanging there from the ceiling, his arms outstretched. But there were already a dozen guns pointing at him, and he had to show them that he was no longer armed, that they didn't need to shoot. Even so, he braced himself, waiting for the security men to open fire. He could almost imagine the hail of bullets tearing into him. As far as they were concerned, he was some sort of crazy terrorist who had just parachuted into the Science Museum and taken 6 shots at the Prime Minister. It was their job to kill him. It was what they'd been trained for. But the bullets never came. All the security men were equipped with radio microphones, and in the front row, Mrs. Jones had control. The moment she had recognized Alex, she had been speaking urgently into her brooch. "Don't shoot. Repeat, don't shoot. Await my command." On the podium, a plume of gray smoke rose out of the side of the broken, useless Stormbreaker. 2 security men had rushed to the Prime Minister, who was clutching his wrist, blood dripping out of his hand. The photographers and journalists had begun to shout questions. Their cameras were flashing, and the television cameras too had been swung around to focus in on the figure swaying high above. More security men were moving to seal off the exits, following orders from Mrs. Jones, while Alan Blunt looked on, for once in his life out of his depth. But there was no sign of Herod Sale. The head of Sale Enterprises had been shot twice, but somehow he had disappeared.